Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for kindly inviting me here this afternoon to talk to you about air power in the Mediterranean. I have to say, going from the higher level philosophical, political stuff this morning down to humble air power is, of course, coming right down to the bottom. But I should say to you one thing straight away, and it's this, that while the British may have been very ambivalent about the status of Cyprus, certainly as far as the naval potential is concerned, they are not ambivalent about the air potential of Cyprus. And what I will do in this lecture is hopefully make that point so you can see why it is that the air opportunities from the sovereign base areas of Akrotiri and so forth is almost unparalleled. You very kindly mentioned my experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about my time, I've changed this slightly, as commander of British forces for the Northern No-Fly Zone, because it picks up a point that I think Philip was talking about this morning, which was the caution you should always attach to intervention operations. And it may well be that in no-fly zone policing we have an alternative to straightforward intervention operations, and you might find that of interest. Well, for my presentation I've entitled, as you can see, Air Power in the Mediterranean, but I think I'm going to talk equally about the history and the importance of air power in the Mediterranean. Because I think it's the history that then leads you on to understanding the importance. What I really want to do today is to establish, first of all, the efficacy of air power. I'm conscious of the fact there are a few army people around the floor who normally poo-poo air power as being something that happens a very long way away and nobody really needs to be interested in. All I would say is ask the Germans if they had shared your opinion. I also want to examine the sort of context in which air power has been used in this area, and to do that, of course, we need to go through the history. And then I really want to look ahead to the future, and I'm not going to be looking exclusively at air power, but to give you a few thoughts about perhaps what Cyprus's future might entail. Well, let me start by looking at a few air power issues. And I want to start by looking at the Yom Kippur War. And although only 26% of US aid was sent by air, in other words, 74% was sent by sea, none of the aid that was sent by sea arrived in theatre until the war was concluded. In other words, it was useless. And without the flow of air assets, which entailed some 27,000 tons of tanks, armour, ammunition, and so forth, and without the 56 ready-to-fight Phantoms and various other aircraft that were delivered directly into theatre, flown by American pilots into theatre, handed over to Israeli pilots, and were flying within 3 hours. Without those assets, I suspect very strongly that, of course, Israel could easily have fallen in the 73 Yom Kippur War. Now, sadly, I don't have enough time to go into too much detail, but and I'm not going to be able to talk in detail about things like the 67 Arab-Israeli War, or indeed analyse the Yom Kippur War, which I've already mentioned. I'm going to say a few words about the Northern Watch, which I had the privilege of commanding, but I do want to focus my attention really on Cyprus and its position in this geopolitical world. Now, I'm very conscious of the fact that whatever I am going to say may well be taken as an example of imperial nostalgia and the desire yet again to control all world events wherever they may be. But as you will recall, perhaps Britain's involvement in the Mediterranean really can be traced back to perhaps 1798, when, as Robert mentioned this morning, Nelson was ordered to mount a blockade of Toulon in order to prevent Napoleon and his fleet from sailing to God knows where, and at that stage we had no idea. Now, you will recall that he was ordered to destroy the French fleet based in Toulon in order to prevent aggression by Napoleon, probably against the Sultan, possibly in Alexandria and Egypt, or maybe even directly in Constantinople. Maintaining a blockade of Toulon on the 20th of May 1798, Nelson's fleet was caught in a storm. I wonder if anybody here knows the name of the wind that blows down the Rhone, which is actually a very strong wind and causes this sort of effects. And even now, ships are quite often lost in the Gulf of Lyon, as it is called. Any thoughts on this? I'll let you consider that, and we'll come back to that later. However, so here we find ourselves, as I say, in May 1798, when Nelson finds himself caught in the storm, blown south off to the Isola di San Pietro, just off Sardinia. His ship was dismasted. They even thought that Nelson would sink at one stage because he'd go on the rocks. However, what that did allow to happen was Napoleon, recognising the opportunity, was able to depart Toulon unobserved. By this stage, of course, Nelson had done his repairs and came back north to Toulon, only to find that Napoleon had vanished. He then decided that the only way he could resolve the issue was to sail quickly as he could straight to Naples, where Sir William Hamilton, of course, was the ambassador, in order to gain intelligence. In Naples, of course, was Emma. And I put up a picture there, just coming out, a picture of Emma as the it girl of 1782. She was gorgeous. I mean, there is no doubt about it. Pops wasn't as gorgeous as painted there some 10 or 15 years later. Nelson had met her in 1793, and he'd actually corresponded with Sir William ever since. And no doubt, while he was anchored off, he looked wistfully across the harbour towards Emma. But if he didn't do that, it's absolutely certain that Emma looked very much towards Nelson. But the indications at the time were that Bonaparte was in Malta, so Nelson sailed there without delay. Arriving off Malta on the 22nd of June 98, Nelson was informed that Napoleon had already taken Malta but had now left, having spent some 3 weeks on the island. So he turned his fleet eastwards towards Egypt, possibly to go northwards again towards Istanbul, Constantinople, and as they started to move southeastwards, HMS Leander reported sails to the east-northeast. This, ladies and gentlemen, was one of the turning points of history. Nelson, hearing that there were sails to the east-northeast, thought they were irrelevant and ordered the fleet to accelerate southeastwards, thereby bypassing Napoleon and going on his way down to Alexandria. Just think for a second what might have happened if that naval engagement had taken place. How the history of certainly France and possibly the world might have changed in that one engagement. Nelson probably would have won it, and Napoleon would have gone to the bottom. However, Nelson did accelerate and arrived in Alexandria. When he got to Alexandria, of course, he found the place empty and started moving northwards. He thought, of course, that Napoleon would have gone northwards to Constantinople, but there was no sign of him up there. But fortunately, when he got to Cape Matapan, he was told that actually Napoleon had indeed landed off Alexandria, and so he quickly turned about and sailed down there. In the subsequent battle at Aboukir Bay, Britain lost 218 killed and 677 wounded. France, of course, lost at least 5,000 people and its entire fleet. Napoleon and his army were stranded. Britain then became master of the Mediterranean, a mastery she never entirely lost. Nelson, of course, who was badly wounded in the battle at about 8 p.m. in the Battle of the Nile, a piece of shrapnel flew right past his head, gaped open his head, a lot of blood. He said, "Oh my God, I am dead. Remember me to my wife." He was taken down below and stitched up. He was somewhat unwell for the rest of the battle. But of course, at the end of the battle, where did he go? Naples. Straight to the arms of Emma. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is another story that I leave for another day. We now fast forward, if I may, into the 19th century. We've already considered the stick man of Europe, the status of Turkey during the 19th century. And I really want to just remind you of the strategic vacuum into which many nations, particularly Russia, attempted to develop. Of course, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, coupled with the progressive yet growing demand for oil, set some of the strategic priorities for Britain in the Eastern Mediterranean. The first was the need to secure the lines of communication to the empire, now passing by and large through the Mediterranean. And the second was to gain access to the new British oil fields of the Middle East. Oil was discovered at Baku in 1846, Iran in 1908, in Iraq in 1927, and in Saudi Arabia in 1932, and Kuwait in 1953. By 1919, Britain controlled about 50% of the world's proven oil resources. But of course, Britain, although she ruled the oil and ruled the waves, she was still, certainly at the turn of the century, running around the world in coal-fired ships. And these ships, of course, were soon to encounter their nemesis, which, although it didn't look very much like it at the time, in 1903, was soon to prove absolutely dominating. Well, only 8 years later, the first use of the aeroplane was made in the Italian-Turkish War of 1911. Italy declared war on the Ottoman Empire on the 29th of September 1911, and after a preliminary naval bombardment, using balloons for reconnaissance and for spotting, Italian naval forces occupied Tobruk and then Tripoli. But on the 23rd of October, an Italian pilot flew over Turkish lines on the first ever reconnaissance mission. And on November the 1st, just a little over a month after the landing, the first aerial bomb was delivered by Lieutenant Giulio Gavotti, who threw 4 small grenades out of his plane against the Turkish troops below. Well, next summer, the Italians advanced out of their coastal strongholds, slowly forcing the Turks back. And thereafter, the Turks, And thereafter, as you can see, the Italians used aircraft for those sorts of roles. And you can see reconnaissance, artillery spotting, transport of supplies and personnel became increasingly useful, and bombing troops, which, although remained fairly rudimentary, still had a big psychological impact. In 1912, a certain Colonel Douay was tasked with writing a report on the campaign. He was a visionary. His imagination had been caught in 1905 by the first Italian dirigible, and in 1908 by the first powered aircraft that Italy had acquired. And in 1910 he had written, "The skies are about to become a battlefield as important as the land or sea." However, by 1914, the outbreak of war, he had become something of an air power zealot, and he was branded a radical. His ideas enraged his superiors, and he was exiled to the infantry. He then continued to agitate in favour of air power, only to find himself imprisoned for insubordination as a one-star officer. He was imprisoned for a year. At the end of the year, he was restored back to post as a one-star officer and reinstated back as head of the Air Force. But his plan, which was really quite visionary, was the idea of using 500 bombers to attack Constantinople with 100 tons of HE per day in order to open up the Dardanelles to Allied shipping. As far as the British were concerned, the outbreak of World War I found us, of course, in control of Egypt, and a base was hastily constructed at Ismailia. And on the 27th of November, just a few months after war began, a Morris Farman aircraft, as you can see, actually carried out a reconnaissance of the Suez because a Turkish advance down through Palestine was feared. And by mid-January, a mixed force of Morris Farmans and seaplanes had been deployed into theatre. Now, of course, in Europe as a whole, air power was being used to a considerably greater extent than it was in this particular part of the world, and much was to be learnt. Indeed, the genesis of the attack called strafing started to be used. And everybody knows what strafing is. It's when you get an aeroplane, go down the dive and fire your guns. Who knows what the origin of the word strafen is? It's not to go down the dive with an aeroplane and fire your guns. It means to punish. And that was the way that the Germans thought of the use of air power. It was a punishment. You strafe the enemy and you punish them. It was nothing to do with going down and doing a particular weapons delivery. Well, by 1917, turning now to the east again, the decision was taken to evict the Turks from Palestine, and General Allenby began his offensive in October of that year. By Christmas, he had taken Jerusalem, interestingly enough, the first Christian to actually have control of Jerusalem for 700 years. But he was faced by 3 armies, the 8th, the 7th, and the 4th. And if the effectiveness of air power in Europe had been impressive, it was now to generate a brand new and altogether different scale of effectiveness. The offensive that started on the 19th of September 1918 against the Turkish armies, the 8th, the 7th and the 4th, you can see there, started out with air attacks concentrated on all the headquarters, so much so that none of the headquarters had communications. On the 19th, a British cavalry advance and armoured vehicles started moving up towards the position of the 8th, but then retreated in somewhat disorder, as you can see, between Tulkarem and Luxor, going to be down towards Nablus. They were attacked in this area extremely heavily by Australian and British aircraft, so much so that General Lehman von Sanders, who you recall was the Turkish central commander, he wrote that the low-flying British bombing formations, relieved every half hour, littered the road with dead troops, horses, and shattered vehicles. Officers repeatedly attempt to rally their troops, but in vain, as the troops were concerned only with their own safety. On the next day, the 8th Army then moved northwards to get out of the area, and meanwhile the 7th Army then tried to move eastwards through the Wadi al-Farah to join up with the 4th Army on the east of the Jordan. Unfortunately, they met the same fate, and as they proceeded north and then eastwards, they were heavily attacked. But the third day, the 21st of September, was really the day of the greatest slaughter. On that day, early morning reconnaissance revealed the 7th still strung out along the old Roman road east through Wadi al-Farah. At least 800 horse-drawn vehicles, troops in marching order, and MT were streaming east to the Jordan. And whereas the 8th had retreated in a fair amount of disorder, 7th at this stage, although they had been attacked, still had the semblance of military order. But all day long, air raids took place on the Wadi al-Farah. One Australian squadron made 6 heavy raids during the day, dropped 3 tons of bombs, and fired 24,000 rounds of ammunition. Other squadrons attacked, and they also fired between 20 and 30,000 rounds of ammunition each. Just imagine that amount of ordnance being fired into horse-drawn transports and troops in straightforward marching order. As you can imagine, the panic and the slaughter beggared all description. But there had, of course, been a lot of successes, and I'll just mention a few of those right now. The first, of course, is the effect of air superiority. I mentioned already the German strategic mistake of removing some of its aircraft in the spring of '42 to go to the Eastern Front. Well, to give you some measure of the capability or imbalance that gave, in 1 week the RAF flew 10,000 sorties, while the Luftwaffe managed just 3,000. Of course, then that completely unbalances the battle, because then you have vast numbers of aeroplanes, RAF, against a smaller number of German fighters, and that makes air superiority even more dominating. But at the same time, the other thing was that the fighters started to be re-rolled into the anti-tank role. And this was, of course, anathema. Fighters were for fighting. Bombers did bombing. But the trouble with the bombers is they kept on missing. And so aircraft like this little Kitty Hawk, you can see there, it's just got a little bomb underneath it, was starting to be used, but woefully inaccurate. But the change came when the Hurricane was suddenly given the capability with the S-gun, the 40mm S-gun that was surplus to requirements, and special armour-piercing ammunition was developed. 2 underwing guns were fitted to each of the Hurricane fighters. They were renamed the Hurricane 2Ds, and 6th Squadron was the first squadron to be equipped. The standard attack manoeuvre was to dive from about 5,000 feet on the target, and as they went down the dive, getting up to their final velocity, they'd fire off their 303 ordinary guns, boom, 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 boom. And when the gun started to hit, then the pilot would press the trigger for the cannon, and 2, maybe 4 cannon shots would be fired. And if they didn't hit, then fire again with your 303, boom, 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 bang, bang, boom, 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 bang, bang. And eventually you would guarantee that you get a hit on the target you were attacking. Very successful with these. I mean, I can give you all sorts of numbers here, but in 1 week they claimed 144 tanks, of which 47 they claimed was destroyed, plus a further 200 other vehicles. So that gives you a measure of the sort of capability that was available. But it has to be said, there were weaknesses. The first was ground fire. If you go down a dive from 5,000 feet in a straight line, doing bang, 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 you're very predictable. And an awful lot of Hurricanes were shot down. So it was not exactly a war winner in that sense. And the second problem that they had was, of course, it didn't have the armour-piercing capability against some of the Tiger tanks and some of the upgraded Panthers as well. However, Rommel was very aware. I should also mention, of course, the final thing was the air support procedures were considerably improved. No longer was there to be 2 battles, there was now just 1 battle. Montgomery and Conyngham lived together, they worked together, they talked together all the time. There was 1 battle, and it became a very successful battle. And so successful was it that, in his Africa Corps diary, Rommel wrote this: officers and men were badly shaken and their fighting capacity considerably reduced by the enforced dispersal, lack of sleep, and the strain of waiting for the bomb. Interestingly, he doesn't refer to the cannons so much, but he does refer to the bombs. And he then went on to say that anyone who has to fight even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete control of the air, fight like a savage against modern European troops. So that sort of gives you what Rommel thought of the attacks by the British. Well, of course, let's have a little look at what then happens next. The Germans are pulled back onto essentially modern-day Tunisia, and the torch landings then take place. Obviously, they swept across, as we know, the region now called Algeria, and confined the Germans into Tunisia, just the top right-hand corner of Tunisia. Rommel, by this stage, found that he was running out of fuel, he was running out of ammunition, because all of his assets were being interdicted. And in the final attempt, in the final battles around Tunisia, Allied air forces destroyed the last attempt by the Germans to relieve the forces. Indeed, in April 1943, an attempt was made to repatriate German forces. But during that attempt, some 432 German transport aircraft were shot down. So, as you can appreciate, there was virtually nothing left to pick up the Germans. Well, after that campaign, of course, we know about the operations up through Sicily and into Italy. And I'm not going to go through that. But certainly by the end of World War II, the RAF had a string of air bases. Some were well found, and others were very badly placed. Many were little more than just a field. Of course, through this area ran the Suez Canal and, of course, the Middle Eastern oil pipelines. Britain still had the mandate in Palestine. It had permanent bases in Egypt, had colonial responsibilities in Gibraltar, Malta, and Cyprus. And by and large, the aspiration at the time was just to put the clock back to 1938 as if nothing had changed. But the whole area was in a state of chaos and bitterness and confusion. And at the same time, the Soviet Union, now as it considered the victor in Europe, had designs on the whole area. And if that wasn't bad enough, some 1.5 million European Jews wanted to move to Palestine. Well, as soon as the victory had been won, British forces were drawn down at a rate that frankly now looks foolhardy. In the autumn of 1945, in 4 months, British forces in theatre were halved. Some British forces who found or felt that they weren't being repatriated quickly enough went on strike. In 1946, British forces who had been trained in the Royal Hellenic Air Force were kicked out of Greece. And at the Italian government's insistence, RAF forces in Italy were withdrawn by the end of 1947. And despite the best attempts by British forces to stop them, of course, the Jewish refugees poured into Palestine, and the hostility that this created, that of course we don't have time for today, ended up in the British abrogating the mandate and giving up the bases in Palestine. Oops, hang on, I'll get it a second. And interestingly enough, after we'd given up the bases in Palestine and withdrawn to our bases on the Suez Canal, we ended up in a very strange situation. Quite often, battles, air combat battles, took place, where British Spitfires watched Egyptian Spitfires take on Israeli Spitfires. And sometimes all two of them or 3 of them attacked each other. So you can imagine what a confusing situation that was. However, on the 16th of October 1951, Egypt abrogated its defence treaty. All Egyptian labour withdrew and riots occurred across the beleaguered British bases. And in July 1952, the colonels' revolt deposed King Farouk, and in April 1954, Nasser became Prime Minister, determined to liquidate the British occupation, which occurred within 20 months. So we found ourselves with no bases in Egypt either. Now, as events in Hungary would soon demonstrate, the USSR was, of course, still a major threat to the region, and an attack down through the Caucasus was confidently predicted. And so on the 12th of January 1955, the Turco-Iraqi Pact was signed, expanded on the 4th of April to include Britain as the nuclear guarantor. It drew in Iran and Pakistan as well. It became known first of all as the Baghdad Pact and then as CENTO. And although the Americans weren't actually directly involved, they gave it their blessing. Of course, CENTO was designed, modelled on the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, to contain the Soviet Union to the south of the borders. And bearing in mind the size of armies in Turkey, Iran and Pakistan, it would be pointless for the British to produce anything other than an air capability. But clearly, The withdrawal from Egypt was going to be sure to create an enormous build-up of forces in Cyprus, and it was really only Cyprus that was going to be able to defend and support Cento. So the decision was made in 1955 to build a new NATO airbase, or NATO standard airbase, on the peninsula at Crecent. This was completed on the 1st of January 1956, and it became the centre for all RAF operations, allowing Nicosia to transition slowly across to a civilian international airport. Now, I won't have time to talk about all the events of Operation Musketeer, which of course you'll recall was the attack on the Suez Canal, but nevertheless, we should recall that many aircraft, not only from Malta, but also, of course, from Crecent, were used to support the attacks in 1956. Interestingly enough, the bases in Libya were excluded from Operation Musketeer because of treaty limitations. But with the completion of Crecent, 4 new squadrons of Canberras were deployed, together with PR support in 1957, and a full nuclear capability was available later that year. Well, of course, even since 1957, this posture has moved on. The first thing is that, of course, you'll recall in 1958, Qasim overthrew the king of Iraq, and Iraq then seceded from the Baghdad Pact, which then became, of course, then known as Cento. Immediately after that, or very shortly after that, the Labour government came to power in 1964 and decided that we could no longer afford bases that were a bit surplus to requirements. The bases in Libya had not been used in Operation Musketeer, and the decision was taken to run them down. At the same time, very shortly afterwards, on the 1st of September 1969, a military coup in Libya ousted King Idris, and within 3 months, 31st of March 1970, the British withdrew completely from El Adam, which was the remaining base on the African mainland. But Cento itself was in difficulties. And you'll probably recall that Pakistan had housed for help against Egypt in 1965 and 1971. And finally in 1979, when the Shah's regime collapsed, Iran withdrew from Cento, followed quickly by Turkey, and then by Pakistan after that, leaving only Britain to be the sole remaining member of Cento. In 1964, Malta had achieved its independence, and as part of the independence package, a large force of British squadrons were put in there. PR9s were put in there, as indeed were Shackleton's squadron. But in the 1967 Defence Review, the forces were wound down, and as a result of which, bitter wrangling over the amount of payments and the amount of money that would come into Malta eventuated. The RAF maintained a hold on Malta until 1979, and by 1979, even that had gone. So, by 1979, we have just 2 bases left in the Mediterranean, at Malta and indeed at Crecent. But let's just remind ourselves, given this very drawn-down presence, where the areas of conflict had been and where they had taken place over the period. And I think it becomes interesting to start thinking in terms of where there was an air dimension and where indeed Cyprus had been involved. So we'll start in Greece. 1946, Greek Civil War. 1948, Berlin blockade, and of course the Arab-Israeli war. Both, of course, the Berlin blockade, all accomplished by air, no ground involvement, basically, and 1948, Arab-Israeli war, considerable air activity. In 1950, and I give you this figure because it's quite a marker, world population, I'm going to like to hazard a guess at world population in 1950. 2.3 billion, so just over 2 billion. So, 1956, Suez. Of course, all the main attacks were led by aircraft, many of which based in Cyprus. 1956 also, Soviet invasion of Hungary, a joint all-arms air and ground campaign. 67, the Arab-Israeli war. You'll recall the Egyptian Air Force was destroyed by the Israelis on the first day of the war, and it was then an extremely great success for the Israeli Air Force. 1968, Czechoslovakia invaded. I was actually here on the island of Cyprus on diving expedition as a cadet when Czechoslovakia was invaded, and all the Balkans at Crecent came up to very high readiness. And there was a fear, the Cento was still going at this stage, but this is the first of an attack, possibly the second one will come down through the Caucasus, and this will be it. The third war may well be beginning here. So, quite interesting.
So Cyprus was potentially involved.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. I mean, we had nuclear weapons here, and my goodness me, there's at least a chance a nuclear weapon would have been lobbed back in the other direction. I mean, we may well have been standing here in a car park, who knows, at that stage. So, 68, Czechoslovakia invaded. 73, Yom Kippur War. Why was that interesting? I mentioned about the resupply. All the resupply that counted came by air. And indeed, one of the problems that you recall Golda Meir had was that she was losing the ground war so fast that all the air assets had to be re-rolled. All the Israeli assets had to be re-rolled into fighter ground attack, even though they had huge losses from SAM 6s, because even though the air war may have been won, Jerusalem would have been taken. And so the Israeli Air Force went onto the offensive, taking out Syrian and Egyptian tanks, enabling the war to at least last long enough for the ground forces to go back on the offensive. Huge air involvement. So that's 73, Yom Kippur. 74, guess what? Turkey invades Cyprus, and there's a fair amount of air activity, but not a great deal. 75, the civil war in Lebanon, with Syria, of course, invading. 1980 to 88, the Iran-Iraq war, a war that was completed by the Battle of the Cities when Scuds were launched between Baghdad and Tehran. 1982, you'll recall this was the year in which the Israelis invaded Lebanon for the first time, and the US with the Marines was situated in Beirut. Cyprus was involved. We had buccaneers based at Akrotiri that were ready to go off and support any American activity that required ground support. As indeed we had Phantoms there, but they didn't get defence at that stage. So that was 82. Operation El Dorado Canyon in 1986. 1986 Operation El Dorado Canyon. Recall that was the retributive attack by the Americans on Gaddafi for the nightclub offensive in Berlin. 1991, Gulf War #1. At the same time, Operation Provide Comfort up in the north protected the Kurds, who were probably going to be taken out, and in fact they thought they were going to be taken out by the Iraqis as soon as the war was over. At the same time, Operation Southern Watch was set up to try and protect the Marsh Arabs. Both of those were mainly air offensives, and indeed, of course, Gulf War itself was mainly an air attack. 1993 to 99, Bosnia, Kosovo. You'll recall that, to begin with, the West looked fairly impotent in its operations in Bosnia, but after deliberate force had taken place, the situation largely went away, and of course Kosovo was entirely an air war with virtually no ground involvement at all. 1994 to 99, Chechnya. The Russian activities through 2 wars, which is a combined all-arms offensive. 1996 to 03, Operations Northern Watch and Southern Watch, of which I had the privilege of commanding Northern Watch at the time. And 2003, of course, Operation Iraqi Freedom, the Iraq War. The Donoful conflict took place way to the south of this, and of course in 2008 we have, of course, the latest Russian-Georgian conflict in the area. Well, of course, what I've shown you is just a snapshot of attacks and invasions and battles that have taken place in this area. I mean, one can't sort of forget things like such as Korea, which took place during this time, Vietnam, of course, more limited things such as Falklands or Sierra Leone. But indeed, a friend of mine who was co-commander with me for the no-fly zone, General David Eptula, calculated if you went to Incirlik Air Base, which I'll show you now, it's just there. If you went to Incirlik Air Base and launched an F-15 in its that's an F-15 Strike Eagle in its strike capability, 75% of all the conflicts that took place since World War II took place within unrefueled range of an F-15 Strike Eagle. 75% of all conflicts. That says something about the volatility of this particular part of the world. Now it starts to think, so what's going to happen here? Well, I'm not going to try and predict the future, and indeed, of course, forecasting the future is indeed highly fraught. As you know, virtually everybody in this world tries to forecast the future. The only thing I will say to you is this: virtually all the pundits get it all wrong. Virtually all of them. If you look at all the wars that have taken place that I showed you just now, virtually none of them had been predicted. Who in 1982 would have predicted that half the British Army would have been down in the South Atlantic in the Falkland Islands? No one. Who in 1990, the spring of 1990, would have predicted we'd be fighting a high-technology war
across Kuwait. I could just go on and on and on. Whichever one you like to go to. None of them are predicted. So I guess you must expect the unexpected. Whatever you do guarantee is the next war will not be the one you thought about. And perhaps there's a reason for that. Because the next war that you predict, you tend to do something about. You either deter it, you get ready for it, you make it not advantageous for the enemy to do it. And so it self-deters. So the only war that really is profitable is the one that you haven't thought about, you haven't prepared for, or you haven't got the assets ready for. And that's the one that you're probably going to have to fight. So what are the risks? Perhaps we can talk about risks without talking about the wars. Well, here's another picture of risk factors. This is produced, interestingly enough, by a group of insurance specialists. But given their success with the banks recently, I don't know if you can read too much into that. But that sort of risk does draw on considerable support. Let's just drill down one level further and try and look at some of the factors. Well, we of course remember the great old Iron Curtain and how close to perilously close we came to war. 1960, you'll recall, Gary Power's incident, oh dear, followed 2 years later, of course, by a Cuba Missile Crisis, oh dear. And everybody thought they were going to go to war, and I mentioned Czechoslovakia in the same sort of breath. But then, of course, we add in the fact that the world has changed now, and the Iron Curtain has gone, and it's been replaced by what I like to call the green hedge, and I choose it deliberately. It's green because, of course, it's the colour of Islam, but it's, of course, a hedge because you can get through it. And, of course, that is probably the fact that we have to take into account now. And we know that there are, well, many millions of people who would be quite pleased if they could to move in on us. Let me give you one number that you might like to consider. If you take the total population of Europe right now, it's about 350 million people. It's quite a lot of people. Add that to the population of North America, and we'll call it 250. It's slightly more than that, but for the sake of the numbers, we'll call it 250 million. So that produces the West, whatever that might be, of about 600 million people. What percentage of that is that of the world population?
10%.
You listen to my lecture before. 10%. 90% of the world do not live like us. 90% of the world do not live like us. And that sort of ratio is about the same as happened in 1789 when the Ancien Regime was overthrown by the mass of the French peasantry. We have a world out there that looks at us, sitting here, in comfort, drinking our wine, having nice lunches, with great jealousy and great envy. And they do. And we ignore it. We think everybody lives like this. If you go into the streets of London and say, gosh, isn't it terrible what's happening in the world? They say, I can't understand it. Why don't we just give them more money? Well, the 10% have got to give to the 90%. The people who currently work a 35-hour week would probably have to work a 60-hour week in order to generate the income capable of producing enough money to go there. So there is a problem. We are extremely fortunate, and we find ourselves in a small minority. Well, while I'm talking about population, let me, nuclear, I should have pointed out the nuclear capability. And again, if you look at Cyprus in terms of nuclear capability, it is surrounded by, of course, a nuclear Russia to the north, a nuclear Israel, almost certainly, and probably very soon a nuclear Iran. Not forgetting, of course, these two down in the subcontinent, China, and, well, almost certainly, well, certainly now, North Korea. So again, we find ourselves in a nuclear encirclement. But I think population is the one I want to really address. There is a thought abounds at present that says there are more people alive now than have ever lived. Ever. It's not actually true, but it isn't far from being untrue, or far from being true, which is a pretty salient thing to think about. And if you look at this next graph here, remember I said to you 1950, 2.3 billion. So there we are, 2.3 billion, right? That sort of lines up okay. So here we are, 2009, which is pretty much where that pointer is there. So these are the people that are alive today, okay? Look at the people who have been alive, quite a few, but not too many, and look at what is coming. We're down here in the developed countries. That's all jolly good. We're all very happy with that, but our population levels are declining. But look at this lot. These are the people who, by and large, have very little, who are jealous, who are envious,
we don't see why it is that we should have Mercedes and other nice cars, air conditioning, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, as you can see, the population is going to, according to the United Nations, is going to level off, well, somewhere around about 10 to 11 billion by, well, 2150, maybe 2100. But of course, as they have recently, the United Nations has recently produced figures to show that that levelling off, which is here, hinges on education for women and women being able to control their fertility. There are three problems with that. Women's fertility, of course, is controlled as much by the Catholic Church, who say, of course, one should not use contraception. It's controlled by Islam, who say that polygamy is a good way of living, and indeed you have a responsibility to produce warriors for Islam. And it's also controlled by what the Africans call the white man's magic, condoms. Most people in Africa do not like condoms, which of course is why AIDS is rampant. But lest you think that AIDS has its own solution, let me just remind you of the case of Nigeria. When I was at Strike Command in the late 80s, we looked at Nigeria as a case in point because we were concerned that there would be depopulation in sub-Saharan Africa. At that stage, the population of Nigeria was 87 million. So we thought, well, if there is depopulation on a world scale and AIDS really takes hold, that would probably maybe stay the same, maybe come down to 60 or 70 million. Population of Nigeria right now, 140 million. So with AIDS, it's pretty much doubled. So just think what might have happened without it. So this is conditional upon women gaining control of their fertility, and that will, of course, then level it off. Other predictions, well, you can choose yourself which one you like. I mean, the worst one is nothing changes, and we just keep galloping on, in which case it just becomes worse and worse and worse. We then end up in a situation where the population currently 6.7, well, it's actually almost certainly 7 billion by now, will reach 11 billion by 2050 and then double every 40 years after that. Well, if it doubles from 11 billion, that's not doubling of capability, another 11 billion mouths have to be fed. And you start to think this creaking world may well not be able to cope. So, population and population growth, I'm sure I don't need to remind you, is occurring very, very much to the east of here and to the south of here. Let me look at some other Let me look at some other strategic drivers. This one, of course, is all about water, and you can see that these are the areas where there is a physical water scarcity, funny old thing, all the way across, and Cyprus, of course, right in the middle. Economic water scarcity, there probably is enough water, but it needs to be got hold of, and so forth. And then, of course, we have Devon, where it rains every single day and never ever stops. There is a new class of hegemon in the world, and they are called hydro-hegemons. Have you heard of these? These are people who have superior positions on the rivers, who then turn the tap on the river up and down in order to gain compliance for the states that are inferior to them, and then rely on, of course, the water that is given to them most as largesse. So there's water, a problem for Cyprus, for this region. And lest we forget, of course, there is the dear old chestnut of oil. A population of 7 billion consumes quite a lot of oil. We've just gone through a recession, which is why right now we actually have a slight glut of oil, which is why oil, I see, is now down to 90 cents a litre around here. It's just gone over, what is it, 110 in the UK, or 105 in the UK, pence per litre. But as soon as the economy takes off again, demand will increase. And the people who currently are starting to want to have more and more of life. So is that somebody trying to stop me out? Or was that a phone call? Of course, the people in India and all the other places that are gradually growing and growing, they will say, well, we want our share. And so the predictions you can see by a company in Surrey called Energy Files, and it's their prediction, they reckon that by 2015, the point of equilibrium is passed. And unless something big, and these are the Saudi oil fields, and these are the Saudi oil fields running off, unless we can find some more Saudi oil fields to fill the hole, Saudi oil fields to fill the hole, North Sea oil fields won't do it, shale in North America won't do it, oil off Senja off Norway won't do it, it's just peanuts. Unless we can find some more Saudi oil fields, we will go into deficit. And then supply and demand takes over. And the laws of supply and demand are immutable. Oil, as these people predict, of $200 a barrel are likely, and oil will then maybe increase to $400 a barrel. Well, so what does all this bleak picture mean for Cyprus? Well, as I've tried to point out, it sits either to the west or north of virtually every strategic driver that there is. Water shortages to the east and south, oil competition to the east, and population surpluses certainly all around. It's at the edge of a nexus of instability for the next century. So, would you prefer the RAF and the Brits to be here, or would you like us to go? I'll leave that to you. Thank you very much.